In Hartford, let's find out if any of those activities are good news for the state of Connecticut and for taxpayers in the state. Senator Rob Sampson joins us now, another Republican senator. Hey, Rob, how are you, sir?
I am doing well, Todd. Glad to join you. Enjoyed your conversation with my friend and colleague, Senator Wong. And good afternoon to all of your listeners as well.
You are from Wolcott. You have been in the state capitol as a senator and a state representative for how long now?
I am in my 11th year.
Damn, you're getting old.
I'm already old, Todd.
All right, what's going on right now that people should know about?
Well, the reason why I wanted to call in is because I really enjoyed the dialogue you had with Tony, and he mentioned, some very, very important and critical issues. But I wanted to bring up the election bills, because to me, nothing is more important to the future of Connecticut. And if you're a Republican and you want to see Republicans ever elected in the state again, I think people need to be very, very aware of these election bills, the two constitutional amendments that are pending in the legislature right now, and how they are going to impact the future of this state. It's a real scary situation, Todd, because I believe if these two bills pass, we might survive the early voting bill, but I think the no excuse absentee voting constitutional amendment that is before the legislature could be the most damaging thing to our state government, the confidence of the people, and the ability for, having elections that people trust going forward.
Well, fill us in on that. What is so dire in this proposal?
Well, let me talk about both of them really quickly. The early voting bill has, in order to pass a constitutional amendment in our state legislature, Todd, you either have to pass it with a significant majority in one vote, a 3/4 majority. If you fail to get there, then you've got to have two consecutive legislatures, not 2 consecutive years, but 2 consecutive legislatures. So new people in the second vote have to pass it by a mere 50% plus one majority. Well, the early voting bill did pass by that measure in 2019, and thank you for your help in encouraging my Republican Senate colleagues not to support the bill in 2019 and go along with the Democrats. And we actually kept them below their 3/4 threshold. So they are back again this year trying to do it. And the problem with the early voting bill is that they want to change our Constitution, which actually has pretty strict parameters for what voting is in the state. And they want to take all of those parameters out and turn it into, well, the Constitution now says that the legislature can vote to determine whatever our elections are. And that includes completely open-ended early voting, which means it could be 2 days, it could be 5 days, it could be 180 days, it could be 4 years.
It could be full-time early voting.
Right, on early voting, yes. You could have.
It could be full-time is what I was saying. You could just go constantly.
Yes. There's nothing to stop them from changing it, and they could change it at will as long as they can get a simple majority, which is not the purpose. The reason why you put things in the Constitution is twofold. One, makes it a lot harder to change because you need to go through this process. And number two, it puts changes before the people. And what I'm afraid of is that they're going to put a simple question before voters that says, are you in favor of early voting? And the average person, based on their own personal convenience, will vote yes. But that is leaving out a lot of information. Like, if I asked you, do you believe in early voting that should last 2 years long? You might say no. If I said, do you want early voting that has no photo identification or no signature verification for people that vote by absentee or no other audits or checks and balances that you might expect in an election, people will have a different view. And that's the concern. And I'm worried about the question that they put before the voters.
Have Democrats articulated what is the problem that they see with our current voting system that needs to be changed?
They simply reiterate their talking point, which is that certain demographics are unable to get to the polls based on the limited time frame of our current voting system, which is 6 in the morning till 8 p.m. on Tuesday in Election Day in November, or 45 days for absentee voting. To me, that seems pretty accommodating. There are other provisions that we could work on to certainly provide access to people. And even early voting is not a completely off the table idea for most Republicans, including myself, as long as it was done in a reasonable and limited way. But they're not talking about that. So it's not even worth having that conversation. What they want is a completely open-ended system where they get to decide through a simple majority legislative vote whatever the terms they think will best benefit them. And that's what's dangerous about it.
Well, I think it's worth talking about an alternative proposal to early voting so that people who are trying to weigh which side is behaving in good faith, that they can look at the two ideas, because we see early voting that goes on in presidential cycles in some states that's, I believe, 6 weeks. And I don't see how anybody can look at a presidential election and say that you need 6 weeks or even 4 weeks or even 2 weeks. A couple of days. Okay, if you want to have a couple of days for early voting, that seems like something that you can argue for. It would make it easier, that given that lives are busier these days than they might have been before. Although I favor an election day. That's me. I think election days are fine, and that people should come with their own motivation to vote, and that it's not the job of the state to hold people's hands and get them to the polls. It's up to them to decide, okay, here are the barriers to voting. Are those worth it to me? And I think we all make those decisions on our own, and that's always worked fine. But what is your position on it? We're talking to State Senator Rob Sampson, by the way.
Thank you, Todd. And I completely agree with your position, and let me address both of those things. The first one is, I agree with you. Having 6 weeks or some extended period for early voting is nonsensical. Campaigns and circumstances on the ground change. I mean, what if we were voting for president, and you had the opportunity to early vote 45 days in advance, and then 30 days before the election, the United States enters into a war with China? I mean, you might want to change who your vote for president was. I mean, there are so many things that could change. Campaigns are invested in a timeline that leads to a point certain, which is election day, in getting their message out and motivating their voters and that kind of thing. And, the data tells us, Todd, that early voting actually has the opposite effect of what the proponents claim.
What do you mean?
It ultimately leads to less turnout. There's been study after study across the country in states that have early voting, and they find out that the turnout is actually less than it is when you have only election day. And I think that is because, election day is an important day. And if your focus is on election day and building up to that moment, both as a campaign or a candidate and a voter, that means something. If you have a month to vote, you might say to yourself, I'll do it next week, or I'll do it on Tuesday if I get a chance. And, a lot of times I think that means that people don't get around to doing it. I think we saw from this recent presidential cycle, Rob, that the media reports on the ballots coming in based on party and creates an aura around how things are going thus far. Maybe people will get discouraged because they think it's already been decided, either in their favor or against them. And so they devalue their own vote based on what the news is reporting. Right. And there are many security concerns that are associated with that exact same situation, because, if you're going to leave your polls open for a period of time, what is happening with that data? Are those votes being counted daily so someone somewhere knows what the results are? Mm-hmm. Or are we leaving those machines open for an extended period where they might be tampered with, that kind of thing? And these are concerns that I brought to the committee last week, but they had no good answers for them. They said, well, let's pass the bill and then you get to see what's in it. And to your second point, Todd, I did offer an amendment that said, okay, fine, you guys want early voting. Well, let's do an early voting amendment that provides for 3 days of early voting within 5 days. The idea being that could give you a Friday, or rather a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday election, or a Saturday, Monday, Tuesday election, or a Friday, Monday, Tuesday election, depending on what the powers that be thought was appropriate, and including photo identification. So I said, you give us that, and we will support it with you, simply because I think it's likely to happen anyway, and I would much rather have a controlled, reasonable type of early voting than get what they're going to give us otherwise.
Mm-hmm. This has a lot of concerns for me because of the who's got control over the votes. So if you're creating, in our current system, the idea is you go to a polling place and the people controlling each city or town's elections have control over that polling place, and they have control over the ballot. So you walk in, you identify yourself, you vote, you put you hand the ballot in at the end, your name's checked off, you leave, and the jurisdiction over that ballot remains in the hands of the voting officials through the complete process. But this whole idea of early voting seems to me designed to weaken security in our voting, to encourage the idea that people can make their own ballots, fill them out in advance, get people to sign them, and otherwise play games with votes. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, most certainly. I think you're referring more to the absentee voting process, but you're absolutely right just the same. I mean, part of early voting would include the Secretary of State's fancy drop boxes that she spent millions of dollars on and had installed all over our state that have no security whatsoever. Today, on Election Day, when you cast your vote, there are representatives of both political parties there. They are monitoring those machines. They are monitoring the ballots. When absentee ballots come in, they are stored in a central location. In fact, they are locked away together by the registrar, the two Republican and Democrat registrars. So they both have custody of those ballots all the time, and there's no funny business. Imagine ballots being stored in mailboxes, essentially, on street corners all across our state that are subject to God knows what. Tampering, vandalism, and certainly no custody or control. The town clerk, closes his shop at 5 o'clock on Friday, and, of course, the entire weekend goes by, and who knows what's happening with those boxes. So it's a big concern. But early voting is nothing, Todd, compared to no excuse absentee voting. That, to me, that is an atrocious system which will open the door for all of the terrible things that currently happen in isolated places in Connecticut. I don't want people to misunderstand me to say that we have this most ridiculous, rampant voter fraud in the state of Connecticut, because we don't. But we do have places where it does happen, and regularly. And those are in the major cities, and usually in Democratic primaries. We had a public hearing a week or so ago where numerous people came from the town of Bridgeport to talk about all sorts of shenanigans that occur during Democratic primaries. And most of them has to do with things like ballot harvesting and people, trading gifts for votes and paying people for going and collecting absentee ballots and that kind of thing. And that will just open the door for that kind of activity statewide if we have no excuse absentee voting.
We're talking to State Senator Rob Sampson. Rob, hold on one sec. We'll get a quick break in, and then we'll wrap up our conversation. Rob is the senator from Wolcott. More coming up on WTIC. WTIC, good afternoon. State Senator Rob Sampson is here. Rob, you heard that. Daylight savings time starts this weekend. Are you a pro-clock move or anti-clock move guy?
I could go either way, Todd. I've lived this way my whole life. I think we got more pressing issues. If there was a bill to eliminate daylight savings time, I would probably support it. But the big issue there is keeping all of our surrounding states, in line so that there's no confusion.
Yes. Interesting. All right. Thank you for that. So back to what we've been talking about, voting laws. You said there were two items. Did we discuss them both?
We went thoroughly through early voting, and we touched on no excuse absentee voting.
All right. So what's the proposal on the absentee voting?
Yeah, so they want to do a constitutional amendment, much like we had before the voters across the state in 2014, which essentially allows no excuse absentee voting. Our Constitution and our laws currently allow you to vote by absentee for a number of reasons. Military, illness, or if you're going to be out of town and not able to vote in person that day. And it's a broad number of reasons, and I think appropriate reasons also. The big issue with no excuse absentee voting, Todd, is that, everybody understands that voting in person is just inherently more reliable than voting that happens through the mail or by some other means online or something. And, historically, we've had elections where maybe 2% of the votes are cast by absentee. And in a case like that, basically, we know it's not a perfect system, but what are you going to do? You have to make sure that people that are out of the country for good reason or people in nursing homes are allowed to vote. So we accommodate that situation knowing that it's an imperfect system. But what the Democrats want to do is they want to blow up no excuse absentee voting so it's a majority of the way votes are cast. And we saw that in the most recent election. They had this Secretary of State mailing out ballot applications to the entire state and everyone's dog at the same time. And you had 35%, I think 650,000 absentee ballots came back. And that just creates all kinds of problems. Other states that have this type of voting, they have lots of protections in place. They have signature verification. They use technology to make sure that there's no funny business going on. And it's not just the potential for fraud. There's a lot of other things. Ballots come back after Election Day. They get held up by the post office. Those voters are disenfranchised. There's just a lot of potential for confusion. And I'm worried that it's an imperfect system that we should not be, trying to encourage. We should be accommodating it when necessary, but we should be creating easier ways for voting in person rather than through the mail.
Rob Sampson, anything else? We got 1 minute before you go.
I would just say that, these two bills, I think, as I said, are the most important thing facing the legislature this year. If you care about your gun rights or you're concerned about the religious exemption or you're concerned about the public option for insurance, all those things matter like crazy. But I will tell you that those things are much more likely to impact your life in the future if you have less Republicans fighting on your behalf in the legislature. And I think that will happen if these bills pass. And that's what concerns me more than anything. And besides that, Todd, at the same time they're trying to pass these bills, they're also trying to allow 16-year-olds to vote and give voting rights to people in prison. There's a lot of madness, and people need to be informed, and hopefully we can create some public pushback and prevent these bad ideas from happening.
And quickly, do we have a timeline on these proposals?
We do not. They have already been through the committee process, and they can come before the House and Senate any day.
Okay, so it's an urgent situation. State Senator Rob Sampson, Yes.
Thank you, Todd.
It's imminent what?
I said it's imminent. It could happen anytime. The legislature could be called into session, and these are ready-to-go bills.
All right, gotcha. Thank you, Rob. We'll talk to you again soon. State Senator Rob Sampson.